dusted off a whole lot of existing experimental data which provide quite good circumstantial evidence for morphic resonance.
What about the blue tits? It's
well, the blue tits is another example, and the blue tit example is one of the few cases we have of a new pattern of animal behavior spreading, and the rate of its spread being carefully monitored. Normally, people don't study these things in any detail. In this case, thanks to the efforts of hundreds of amateur bird watchers all over Europe, this was studied. What happened was that blue tits, these little blue birds, blue-headed birds, discovered in about 1920 that when milk was delivered to doorsteps in England, that they could tear the top off the milk bottle and drink the cream. And when this had first been discovered, about 20 years after milk deliveries began in England, nothing happened for 20 years. Then a blue tit in Southampton in southern England discovered this, and it spread locally, and the other blue tits copied, until lots of them were doing it. And then the habit turned up somewhere else, far away, far further than blue tits could have flown. So, because they don't usually move very far from their home.
So they couldn't have told each other?
They couldn't have told each other. It was discovered independently in another city, and then somewhere else. And the rate of independent discovery, which was carefully documented, accelerated. More and more of them were learning to do it, until by the late 30s or 40s, this was happening practically everywhere in Britain. And the rate of discovery accelerated in such a striking way that the professor of zoology at Oxford, Sir Alister Hardy, came to the conclusion that something like telepathy might be involved. It seemed mysterious to many people at the time. But the most interesting results are the Dutch ones, because once British blue tits had started doing this, then continental ones started in Holland, in Sweden, in Denmark, and other countries. And the habit spread in Holland as it did in Britain, a similar pattern. But the difference is that in Holland, when the Germans invaded, the delivery of milk bottles stopped. So there was no more milk for the blue tits to steal. Didn't begin again until 1948. Blue tits don't live more than about 3 years. So after 8 or 9 years, there were no blue tits left that could remember the golden age of free cream before the war. And yet, when milk deliveries began again in the Netherlands, then within 2 or 3 years, all over Holland, blue tits were stealing milk.
What about the humans? What kind of experiments have been done? And to what extent do they prove your hypothesis of formative causation? Can you give me some examples?
Yes. Well, first, I should say that this hypothesis applies to human learning as well as rat learning. Obviously, it's a general principle. And so it means that it should be getting easier, for example, for children to learn to program computers just because many have learned to do it, or to play video games because many have learned them already, or to solve the Rubik Cube. These predictions in the human realm are supported by a certain amount of, well, a lot of circumstantial evidence, but we need to control for all the other variables. So you have to do quite specific experiments. And a lot of experiments have been done now on morphic resonance in human psychology. 2 or 3 have given inconclusive results, but the great majority, something like 90% of the experiments that have been done, have shown quite clear effects in the direction of morphic resonance. To give a few examples, the easiest to understand, although not the best experiment, is one that was done with crossword puzzles here in England 2 years ago. This was done at Nottingham University, and the person who did it, a young woman called Monica England, reasoned as follows. If morphic resonance is happening, it should be easier to solve today's crossword puzzle tomorrow than it would have been yesterday, because so many people have done it today. Now, hundreds of thousands of people do newspaper crosswords. So to do this experiment, all you need is to persuade a newspaper to supply their crossword in advance, so you can test people before it's published and after. And we persuaded the London Evening Standard newspaper to supply their crossword in advance for this experiment. And the day before it was published in London, students in Nottingham were tested with this crossword and with a control crossword that was not published during this period. 10 minutes on each crossword to solve as many of the clues as they could. And then you mark it to see how many they've got right, and that gives you a score. And then other students were tested after it had been published in London. And this newspaper is not circulated in Nottingham, so none of them would have done the crossword. And it turned out that the score on the test crossword increased quite substantially by about 20%, whereas the control crossword didn't change at all. This shows that the test crossword became easier to do after people had done it in London. Now, the control was controlling for individual variations in crossword solving skills. That didn't change, you see. You look at the test results relative to the control. Anyway, this experiment is something which I've subsequently found from people who do crosswords habitually is quite a well-known fact. A lot of people have written to me saying that they do the Times crossword puzzle, which is a very difficult one in England, regularly. And they've often found that they do better if they do it in the evening of the day that it's published, or even the next day, rather than if they do it straight away in the morning.
Because?
Because so many people have already solved it. Well, the people who have found this by experience have no explanation. They just have found this by experience. And when the results of this crossword experiment were published, then suddenly they found an explanation for something they'd discovered by themselves.
Who is sitting across from me? Is he the new Darwin and Einstein combined, as many people think? Or someone who, as many of his future table companions think, has developed a brilliant theory which is hopelessly wrong? Whatever one thinks of the theory, the experiments are baffling. People who learn the old Morse alphabet more easily than the new one, which is thought to be simpler and more logical. Nursery rhymes from Japan.
I've done some experiments with Japanese nursery rhymes. The reasoning there was that if you take a nursery rhyme that's been known to millions of children over the centuries, and they've all learned it to sing it, in Japan, it should be easier for English or American people or Dutch people or German people to learn that nursery rhyme than some other rhyme, similar rhyme. Now, the problem with this experiment, it's a problem that can't easily be surmounted, is to find another rhyme that's equally intrinsically easy or difficult. To do this, I had the help of a Japanese poet, Shuntaro Tanikawa, who's one of the leading poets in Japan, who wrote some other rhymes with a similar rhythm and word pattern to a common Japanese nursery rhyme. And I then got groups of people and individuals to memorize. He gave 2 false rhymes and there was 1 real rhyme. I didn't know which was the real one myself. And got groups of people to memorize these rhymes by chanting them in the way that children do. And then later they were tested to see how much they could remember of each of the rhymes. And sure enough, they were able to remember more of the genuine nursery rhyme than of the other 2.
Much more, or?
Oh, yes. Well, they were able to... so they remembered it about twice as well as the others. It was quite a big effect. So this is the kind of effect one would expect. This, however, was one of the first experiments I did, and one of the problems with it is that you can never be sure that the new rhyme is equally difficult to the old one. So it's not as convincing an experiment as it could be. Nevertheless, I would have been worried if it hadn't worked.
Yes. You wrote, when people learn something new, such as windsurfing, then as more people learn to do it, it should tend to become progressively easier to learn just because so many other people have learned to do it already. That is windsurfing. When I'm talking about the Industrial Revolution, for instance, it occurs in the Western Hemisphere, yes, for 2 centuries. Why did it not show up? Or why was it not imitated at the same time in, for instance, Africa, India, Indonesia, Latin America? Is this a stupid question from my side?
No, it's not a stupid question, but, the question is, the general question is one of